So in this next session, we're going to return to this issue of measuring people's preferences. I think spending some more time on some of the themes that came up earlier this morning. Jim Hamlet's going to moderate this session. I don't think he needs to be introduced to Jen.
Thank you. So I see this as closely related to the earlier session where we were talking about if we had information about people's preferences, what would we do with it? That, of course, begged the question of how would we get information about people's preferences and how reliable is that information. We had some discussion of the relative merits of revealed preference and stated preference and the like. And so for this panel, I'm pleased to introduce the first speaker, Ellen Kupnick.
Jay, could you hit the fourth button behind you over there? Not that one. Yeah. Thank you. All right. I've given up on this. So the title of this overall session was to look at the effect of behavioral economics or the implications of behavioral economics on research. So I took that pretty literally in my title, Behavioral Economics and the Lessons That Can Be Learned from Behavioral Economics for Stated Preference Methods. I want to say that I'm not making any statements or analysis with respect to behavioral economics implications for policy design. I really think that there are a lot of benefits that could flow and already from research into the behavioral implications, cognitive psych and economic implications on the design of policy, like for organ donations, for instance. It seems to me to be immediately relevant. But that's a case, like for organ donations, where you already know the goal that you want. It's clear what society's goals are. You want more of these things from people as they die. So, but where we don't know the goals so much and where we really want to understand people's preferences for deciding on what goals should be and what particular areas we should move forward on in policy, then I'm less clear about it. So, having said that, my analysis is a little bit more wonky than taking on the entire debate with behavioral economics and preferences. What I'm doing is taking this given that cost-benefit analysis is going to need monetary measures of preferences for health and environmental improvements. And then I'm asking, well, what can behavioral economics say to folks like me that do stated preference research that's going to improve the validity, the robustness of the values that come out of the research that people like me and others do. So, and you might ask yourself, well, why is he talking about behavioral economics and stated preference? These are two different things. One's about behavior and the other's about stated preferences, that is, response to hypothetical, to surveys, to hypotheticals. And you might also ask yourself, well, might the lessons learned go the other way? That is, from survey work to behavioral economics. And I guess I do want to argue that a lot of the issues that behavioral economists worry about are things that we, as stated preference folks, have been worrying about for a long time as well. And so the two of us are kind of working together. What I think I'm coming out on overall is that there are some specific issues that behavioral economists emphasize that given the heterogeneity of techniques that we use in stated preference methods, these broad range of methods, that maybe we should emphasize adopting certain measures much more frequently than we do already. That is, certain techniques to write surveys, to design questions that we sort of know about already but are not frequently used in surveys. So, and if you're interested in what seems to be the more direct link between behavioral economics and valuation, which would be from revealed preference approaches, Kerry Smith already has a paper on that. So Kerry's here, and you can talk to him about getting his paper. So the basics is, so let me now compare behavioral economics and stated preference approaches. So behavioral economics uses psychology and economics to explain, predict, or influence judgment and choice in sort of real-life settings. That's from Lowenstein, who would call himself a behavioral economist, I think. And stated preference research really explains and predicts judgment, preferences, and choice in a survey setting. We also hire cognitive psychologists to work with us to do these studies. And you could argue, I suppose, that behavior in a survey context is still behavior. So what's different about these two? Well, the answer is the word influence. That's the central difference. And that does lead to, I think, a basic philosophical difference between these two camps. So Dan O'Reilly, if that's how you say his name, has a wonderful comment here. The first one, people are Homo Simpsons. It's a great comment. And in that vein, he turns Adam Smith on his head and says that rather than a true invisible hand being the beauty of a market system which as if by an invisible hand, will lead to the maximization of social welfare, he says what's really going on is pervasive irrationality, and that's really invisible. So it really flips it over. And if you believe that, then you come quickly to the idea that choices should be manipulated, at least in some cases, or nudged. And that gets you to paternalism. Now, even at this level, although there's much to disagree with in the stated preference camp, there are some lessons. One is to be wary of our design choices for designing these surveys, and be wary of how we interpret stated preference results, because this irrationality can be lurking underneath. We could be, half of our sample could be Homo Simpsons, but if it's 5%, well, maybe we don't have to worry about it as much. And really, maybe it comes down to that, because in the stated preference camp, and again, there are people who are in both camps, so I don't want to make that a strong division. There is a neoclassical tradition, a Homo economicus. People are mostly rational. But even if they're irrational, and I think this is Kerry and Belzer and other people taking this position as well earlier today, that you don't want to manipulate choices. You don't want to nudge people's choices in a survey. You want to try to be as neutral as you can and try to accommodate cognitive biases and other issues with cognition and emotion in the survey. So, for instance, this is from a study that we're doing right now from a survey, and we're trying to portray brook trout. That's a pretty neutral representation of brook trout. You could show it in color. Actually, it looks like there's a little color there, but there's not. Maybe we could wipe out the little grasses there and make it even more neutral, but that's kind of the idea. But there is basic commonality, I think, between these two camps, and again, I'm using that loosely. Both behavioral economists and stated preference folks aim for clear communication and to account for irrationalities, biases, and cognitive issues. And there's a lot of biases and cognitive issues that both groups know about and work on. And I'm listing them. These are the ones I'm not going to talk about, just so you know. I mean, there's a long list of these things. But these are the ones I am going to talk about, and I'll just go through them one by one and then come to some conclusions. So the first is a wonderful phrase called coherent arbitrariness. And that means, and I think we talked about coherency earlier today, where preferences can be coherent, the answers to survey questions throughout a multiple willingness to pay question survey can be quite coherent, but yet they may be arbitrary. Those answers might be arbitrary because of one reason might be starting point bias. So this is something, you see a number up before those willingness to pay questions get there, or maybe in a dichotomous choice setting, you're given a number, and that kind of biases your entire frame of reference, and you answer in ways that really deviate from what you would otherwise have answered if that starting point wasn't there. So, of course, as stated preference researchers, we know about this, and we try to do everything we can to eliminate it, or at least recognize it statistically. Another wonderful phrase is experience utility versus decision utility. So the idea here is that experience utility is your utility you get from pain and pleasure and what Sugden would say, at the point of consumption. and a reliance potentially on that more than in neoclassical economics decision utility, which is that you've chosen A over B, so you must get more utility from A than B. And if you think people are irrational and choose A over B even though B is better, then you'll favor experience utility more. Now, List finds that experienced subjects do exhibit fewer anomalies in their behavior. And so one idea might be to bring more experience to stated preference surveys. So certainly experiences that people have do influence their willingness to pay. Carlson and Martinson did a willingness to pay survey both before and after a big storm in Sweden, and they found lower willingness to pay from people who were surveyed after the storm than before. That doesn't surprise. I wouldn't think that would surprise us. But the moral of that story is avoid doing surveys after big events that are on the topic you're studying, especially when those events are highly improbable, because people will be biased towards the last big event. We might sample people who claim they have more experience. So Maureen and I did this in our study on valuing chronic bronchitis by bringing in people who had relatives that had chronic bronchitis. So they were familiar with this kind of a disease. The problem with going down this route is for non-use values, where the very notion of having experience seems to violate the idea. But one way to do this is to build in experience. And I've been intrigued, although I haven't done any studies on it yet, about the possibilities of virtual reality. So this is a slide from Glenn Harrison's paper on this, and you could get a GIS rendering of an area. Once it's in the computer, you can fly through the area. You can look at it from different angles and get sort of an experience of this reality. Of course, you're creating a context here, and that's going to influence willingness to pay. So one has to do this according to certain rules. Ian Bateman is another example where he used before and after renderings in a survey that he did. Repetition is another idea from behavioral economists. Plot and List both found that practice and repetition produces stable and theoretically consistent preferences. So for stated preference, you would provide practice questions. You could drop the first response you get in a choice experiment setting where you have multiple choice screens. And it might, for this reason, favor choice experiments where you do have multiple screens, multiple bites at the apple, over contingent valuation where it's basically a one-shot willingness to pay question. Now, these are things we already do, for instance, with practice questions. But what I'm saying here is maybe every stated preference survey should now have practice questions in it. I don't have time to give you an example of that. Another issue is choice complexity overload. So too many choices make people less happy and can lead to bad decisions. Certainly this has to be true in America relative to other countries. They're less fortunate to have the diversity of choices that we have here, or choosing your power company or your cell phone operator and whatever. This would seem to favor contingent valuation over choice experiments, actually, and maybe limiting the number of alternatives you ask in choice experiments or the number of attributes that you're asking about as well. Constructed values. Context matters. This was a big issue, I think, for a while, and David, who will be on the panel, had a lot to do with that. I think the position is pretty well consensus now. Yes, context matters. Preferences are at least partly formed depending on the context you have. And that's not unique to environmental goods or surveys. If anything, the behavioral economists have showed us that this is pervasive. It affects markets. It affects everything. I'll skip that one in the interest of time. One issue is, do stated preference studies, do they matter more? Does context matter more in stated preference than in revealed preference studies? And there's a nice study by Alpizar who conducted a natural field experiment and a stated preference survey and found that while there still was hypothetical bias for the stated preference surveys, the social context bias that he was looking for didn't show up. So the way how anonymous you were when you answered questions and issues like that did not have an effect. Here's an opportunity for behavioral economists. We, as stated preference folks, are focusing more on the family decision-making, trying to get inside the family. And from what I can tell, behavioral economists mostly are focusing on unrelated individuals and how their interactions are affected by social norms and group decision-making. I think the family is ripe for behavioral economics work. Bateman and Monroe found joint decisions are more risk-averse than spouses' individual decisions, and Sandy and Vic Adamovich and myself, these are some hot-off-the-press results where we find that husbands are willing to pay more for a gain in an IQ point than wives are. But then when you get that separately, and when you get the couple together to rethink the whole thing, the A couples, they're actually willing to pay more than either was separately. So I think that's something consistent with Bateman and Monroe. But when you ask the couples together without giving them a chance to develop their own ideas, then that 37-18 kind of fits in between them. So that's kind of pretty interesting. So just to conclude then, behavioral economists, their focus on psychological foundations of behavior, I think actually applies to behavior in surveys, and we can learn from them. Behavioral economists shows that biases and anomalies in the stated preference literature are not unique, but occur in the real world as well. In their concern for cognitive biases, stated preference and behavioral economists have much in common, and we can contribute to each other's literature and progress. And finally, and this echoes what Maureen says, and Maureen and I do not agree that often, so we are not in lockstep, but in this one we are. And I think stated preference approaches do have an advantage over revealed preference approaches because as a stated preference researcher, you have control over information provision that a revealed preference researcher who's facing the invisible hand of irrationality doesn't. That's out there, it's given. Now, it doesn't mean the balancing question, does hypothetical bias and other issues outweigh this? I don't know. But I think behavioral economists have actually, in an ironic way, made stated preference research more important. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Who's next? I'll get it up. You want me to get yours up, David?
I guess I'm next.
Oh, I got it.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, he's there. Oh, sorry.
So next I'm pleased to introduce David Leibson from Harvard to talk about how our preferences reveal.
Thanks very much.
From stated.
Thanks very much for the organizers for inviting me. It's a remarkable group here today. So let me just set the stage. There are revealed preferences, which, as you know, are the choices that people make. And then there are what I'll call normative preferences, which are the choices that they should make. And, of course, these are not the same, though many economists treat them as if they are. Let's think through a few examples together. In 401ks, with employer stock as an option, approximately a third of retirement savings is invested in employer stock. This choice, I think, does not reveal people's true interests. It reveals a mistake. American workers falsely believe that holding stock in one company, their employer, is less risky than holding stock in a mutual fund. Here's another example. American workers in retirement plans are not taking advantage of free money. If you're over age 59 and a half, you can put money into the plan, you can get matched, you can take your money back out the next day, and there is no tax penalty. We tried to explain this to American workers. We paid them to take our lesson. It generated no effect. This does not mean that American workers are financially sated. It does not mean we have all the money we need. It means that we're making an error. Here's another example. We took Harvard staff, who by and large have master's degrees, not the faculty, the staff. We told them to allocate 10,000 real dollars. We gave them this money for real across 4 S&P 500 index funds. And we told them they would keep whatever money they made on this initial investment net of fees. If they chose the least costly fund, they would have paid $255 in fees. If they chose the most costly fund, they would have paid $581 in fees. On average, they paid $518 in fees. And again, they're choosing among S&P 500 index funds. They're all index funds. Had they thrown darts, this is how they would have done. 3% of our subjects got this right, and they had the prospectuses, by the way. Well, then we thought we would educate them. We would make sure we had highly experienced, knowledgeable investors. We gave them an additional sheet that said, by the way, in case you didn't notice, here are the fees in percentage terms and in dollar terms, and that's what we ended up with. Now, 9% of our subjects got things right. We're not learning that this is their true interest to overpay for mutual funds. We're learning that they're making a mistake. I want to talk about 5 categories of mistakes. Passive choices, or 5 domains in which mistakes are common. Passive choices, complexity, limited personal experience, third-party marketing, and intertemporal choice. These are all red flag zones. So first, passive choice. The prominent example that's often discussed in policy circles these days is automatic enrollment in 401ks. If you tell people it's your job, looks like we lost the label, if it's your job to opt in, then you end up with the green data here. Slowly, people opt into the plan. If you automatically enroll them in orange, then, as you see, very few people opt out. Typically, only about 10% opt out. At this company with low-income workers, about 20% opted out. So what is their true preference? It is not, I argue, what is revealed by their behavior here. It is probably some mix between what you get when you automatically enroll them and what you get when it's up to them to enroll. Complexity, a second domain. Complexity generates 3 distortions in revealed preferences. First, it delays choices. Second, it biases choices. And finally, it adds noise to choice. Let me again show you some data from the 401k realm. Here are 3 cohorts of workers who have all joined the plan slowly over time, in many cases not joined the plan. We started out following them when they were not enrolled, and then slowly they joined this plan. They're getting reminders, they're getting communications, but by and large, they're not taking advantage of this retirement savings opportunity. Then we intervened, and for another cohort of workers, we mailed them once a year a communication that didn't just say you should join the plan, but also said, here's a letter, you can mail it back to us, check a box, drop it back in the mailbox, and you'll be enrolled. And by mailing them that communication 3 times, we drastically changed their behavior. Again, what is their true interest? Is it the data we got down here from just tracking people and their choices? Or is it the data that we got up here by nudging people, giving them a 2-second enrollment technology? Limited personal experience. Here's data from credit cards. And you can see what happens as card holders age in their relationship as card holders. So they're beginning here with 0 tenure, and they're going from 0 tenure to 70 months of tenure. And you can see when they start having the card, their behavior is radically different from their behavior when they've had the card for years. Their tendency to take cash advances plummets. Their tendency to pay late fees plummets, and their tendency to pay over-limit fees plummets. The initial behavior is confusion. They don't understand the rules. Eventually, they get trained up, and they start behaving much more rationally. Third-party marketing. I think it's obvious here when it's a naive consumer interacting with a very sophisticated organization, salesperson, communication, whatever, it's very easy for the consumer to get confused and do things that we would say perhaps don't make so much sense. Shrouded attributes is one area that I've studied where consumers, in essence, don't see all the hidden costs in the relationship that they have with that firm. Say the cost of printer ink. I don't know whether you know this, but when you buy a printer, a DeskJet printer, for example, costs about $100, and the NPV of the ink that you're buying costs about $2,000. Intertemporal choice, another key area. Which set of preferences is valid? Is it today's decision to exercise tomorrow, or my decision tomorrow not to exercise after all? We have lots of internal conflicts about our diet, our savings, our willingness to get educated if we're teenagers, our willingness to use safe sex, I guess if we're any old person, and our general tendency to accept medical adherence. We all say we know we should take our pills, and about half of us do. Here's an example from the work of Reed and Ben Lewin. They asked Dutch workers, what snack can I deliver to you for next week? And the Dutch workers chose fruit or chocolate? Fruit, of course. It's going to come next week. So next week I'll have my fruit. And then, of course, the researchers come back next week and say, we're here. What would you like? And the Dutch workers say chocolate. Here's another example, again, with Reed, Lowenstein, who we heard about a moment ago, and Kalyana Raman. They asked their undergraduate subjects, choose among 24 movie videos. Some were chosen because they were lowbrow, and some were chosen because they were highbrow, but these low and highbrow labels were not revealed to the subjects. Well, what movie would you like to watch tonight? Lowbrow. Give me something fun tonight. What about 2 weeks away? Not lowbrow. I'll watch a highbrow movie in the future, lowbrow movie tonight. Again, what is their true interest? The preference they express for this evening, give me, Arnold, or the preference I express for next week, give me a movie about the Holocaust. Now, our view, the collaborators on this paper are Bridget Madrian, James Choi, and John Bashairs. Our view is that when people engage in revealed behavior, we're not necessarily learning purely about their true normative preferences. We're learning about their true normative preferences and all sorts of decision-making biases. So we need to come up with a better way to infer what those true normative preferences are. And I want to quickly review 6 different ways of doing that, none of which is the gold standard, but which we think jointly give us some leverage on the problem. And I'm echoing actually some of the comments in your talk a moment ago. So I'll talk about structural estimation. I'll explain more about that in a second. Active decisions, meaning forcing people to express a preference rather than letting passive choices guide us. Asymptotic choice, the learning. Aggregated revealed preferences using some wisdom of the crowds. Reported preferences. And finally, expert opinion or informed preferences. So, structural estimation. We're going to go out and estimate standard structural parametric models that include both an underlying fundamental normative preference and some psychological bias. And we'll estimate those mechanisms and those underlying preferences and biases jointly. Here's an example. In work with Andrea Repetto and Jeremy Tabachman, we tried to explain the behavior of U.S. consumers, incorporating all the normal motives and present bias. We're trying to explain things like wealth accumulation and credit card borrowing, which seem on the surface to be contradictory. For example, 2 out of 3 households don't pay their credit card bill in any given month, or they don't pay it in full. So we build a rich structural model, all sorts of classic ingredients, as well as the psychological bias here, which is present bias. And we solve the model using backwards induction. We then estimate the present bias parameter, beta, which is a value of 0.7. That means that individuals downweight the future by 30%. Anything that comes in the future gets an extra downweighting of 30%, and then a standard exponential discount rate, which is ostensibly the normative preference, of 0.96. So we have a 4% kind of normative discount rate, and then an additional 30% present bias, which is the psychological error. That's one example. That's structural estimation. Second example, active decisions. What if we can't trust people's passive choices, and we want to force them to tell us really what they want, focus on the question, and give us an answer? Here's an example from one study, again with Choi and Madrian, James Choi and Bridget Madrian. In the blue case, we told workers, you have to call us if you want to enroll in the savings plan. Call the HR office. But in the red intervention case, the workers are told at this same company, you must call us, and you must tell us whether you want to be in the plan or not. You are obligated to answer this oh-so-important question. Do you want to be a saver, or do you not want to be a saver right now? And when we force people to answer the question, we get 30% greater enrollment rates than when we tell people, call us or not. In that case, only about 40% call us at the beginning of their tenure. Asymptotic choice. Here's the idea simply that people don't know that much when they start any exercise. And over time, they become better and better and better at what they do and eventually figure it out. So, for example, at low tenure, workers are by and large not enrolled. At high tenure, by and large, they are enrolled. Here's another example. This savings plan went through a big change. In Jan 97, they switched from having a match threshold, meaning employees got matched up to 5 to 6% of pay, that's the employees in orange, to a match threshold that was at 7 to 8% of pay. Different workers were slightly different. And what we saw is slowly workers shifted away from the 5 to 6% contribution rate, that's the orange line going down, and shifted towards the 7 to 8% contribution rate. That's the gray line going up. If we looked at what happened right around the time the policy changed, you can see a drop and a bump up here, but then you have to follow workers for 3 or 4 more years to see all of the change, or at least in this case, a lot of the change. It takes people time to respond. We cannot rely on their short-run response to gauge their long-run true interest. Aggregated revealed preferences. There's all sorts of noise in the behavior that we see, and that noise reflects to a certain extent idiosyncratic tastes and to a certain extent idiosyncratic confusion. But the means are often very sensible decisions. For example, if you look at Investment Company Institute data, 68% of the allocations are in equities. If you look at TIAA-CREF data, 58% are in equities. Those are sensible allocations to equities and retirement plans. If you look at the individual data, it's all over the map. So here, too, there's something about the herd that's making some sense, though obviously, occasionally, the herd goes over the cliff. So it's not a gold standard. Reported preferences. Asking people, what do you want? What should you do? Not what will you do, but should you exercise? Should you eat well? What do you want for your life as opposed to what are you realistically going to do tonight when dessert is served? Here's one example. Procrastination and undersaving. When you survey American workers, on average, out of every 100 workers who were surveyed, 68% say, I am saving too little. 24% say, I'm going to fix that problem in the next 2 months. How many actually do? 3%. So this is the reality. What are our true normative preferences? Is it, 3% are actually acting. Is that the true interest of the American worker? Or is it the 24% who plan to do something about it? Or is it the 68% who know they should do something about it but don't plan to in the next 2 months? I think we have to address these differences and not be so reliant, as economists traditionally are, on just the behavior that we see. Here's another example. If you ask people leaving a retirement savings seminar, what are your plans vis-a-vis your retirement plan? 100% say they're going to enroll in the 401k plan. Well, we follow them for the next 3 months. How many actually enroll? 14%. And how many would enroll if they didn't go to the seminar? 7%. Well, again, what are the true preferences? I don't think that action should be the only guide. The revealed preference of 14% joining the plan. Now, how do Americans feel about all of this paternalism? They like it. At firms with automatic enrollment, 97% say it was a good thing. And even more remarkably, 79% who had automatic enrollment and opted out, for whom it was not good, say it's a good thing that society does this, even though it wasn't good for me personally. Finally, the last category, expert opinion. Sometimes asking the general public, what do you want, or observing the general public's action is not the best guide. And I think we're exactly in the community of experts who sometimes know better than the general public. We should not be elevated to dictator status, but we should not be ignored either. The public does not have a monopoly on knowledge of what is right and good in the world. So, my conclusion. Choices that we observe, choices revealed by the public, illustrate or reveal both normative preferences, what is truly in people's interests, and lots of complex and important decision-making biases. Hence, we economists have been making a grave mistake for the last few decades. We've been equating revealed preferences, people's choices, with normative preferences. That's an error, but we know how to fix it. There are 6 suggestions here, and I'm sure many others that I've left out. Structural estimation, where we model everything simultaneously. Active decisions, where we force people to confront these important decisions and think about them rather than letting passive action end up being our guide to outcomes. Asymptotic choice, what happens over time as people learn and gain experience. Aggregated revealed preferences, what is the herd doing, and does that give us any information? Reported preferences, what do people say that they should do, as opposed to what they actually do? And finally, expert opinion and informed preferences, what do the people who have spent a lifetime thinking about it suggest is the appropriate course of action? Thanks very much.
Thank you. So next speaker is Jay Sjogren of the University of Wyoming, and I just have to comment that it looks like Jay is trying to one-up Richard Zeckhauser, who yesterday spoke about the 5 neglects. Jay has the 6 nagging questions.
Okay, thank you. I changed the title slightly. I think Alan and David's talks made it clear the link between behavioral economics and trying to understand preference elicitation. That list of 6 items, I bet we could if we took the time and recoded it, we'd probably find the same exact 6 things in contingent valuation design, choice experiments, everything that people have tried to do over the last 30 years with just different names, like reported preferences versus stated preferences versus, asking people what they think. So in one sense, the easy question is, can behavioral economics help us understand something about the dollar values we assign to risk regulation? I'll say yes. Some of it's old wine in new bottles. Some of it is new eyes on old concerns. So I as I've said before, if integrating psychology more into economics makes sense, let's do it. I will confess that most of my career I've tried to avoid it. I've spent most of my career trying to create institutions that chase out all your emotions when you make decisions, because I'm curious about the institutions that have to exist to create the people we assume do. And so I'm very interested in understanding how to build institutions that will turn you into a money pump, that will turn you all your emotions, and you put them on your sleeve and I'll make money off of them, and then you'll have less money, and then you choose whether that's a good thing or not. All right? And I think what David did was give a lot of examples about that, essentially arbitraging people by showing them what money they were leaving on the table and trying to see what works in convincing them not to do that in the future. And I think a lot of the things we're going to talk about is true. Now, over the years, this has sort of organized my thinking, because usually we sit up here in Markets for Economics thinking about value created by trade. That's my definition of economics, not rational choice or studying the principles of rational choice. It's value created through trade. But environmental resource problems, risk regulation, we usually think about missing markets and try to figure out how to fill that hole so we can exploit the win-win that trades create. But at the same time, they're just not markets in a lot of cases, and they're not just missing, they're just not there. They're not even in how we think about it. So operating in this interaction here where you've got the middle of the Venn diagram here, trying to understand how people are making decisions about risk, use as much information you can, because that's where you're sitting. Now, in terms of behavioral economics, we got to say it's popular. I went to the Amazon place this morning, the bookseller. Nudge, number 72. But here's my question. If the market is not a rational allocation of good information, should we trust that number being 72 as being so low? Given this classic on environmental economics and theory and practice is 82,000, I'm way less worried about it now, because you can kind of see how high up the different books are in terms of being popular. If we wanted to frame behavioral economics, Thaler framed it based on 3 items: bounded rationality, bounded willpower, and bounded self-interest. Bounded rationality we've talked about for probably even longer than Herb Simon back in the 50s. So to me, this is a land grab. I wouldn't consider this really behavioral economics. I consider this part of economics. Bounded willpower, the commitment devices, trying to get yourself the StickK.com, where you can post your credit card and post your plan, and if you don't make it, they send your money to a charity you hate. Go to it, StickK.com. There's also a book out there called The Hostage Diet, which essentially is, if you want to lose weight, you put up your money, meet your targets, you keep your money. If you don't, you send it to a charity you hate. Okay? We went the wrong way. Bounded self-interest, I think we've talked about that for a long time. That's the other book of Adam Smith. So in a way, it's pulling all these ideas together and putting them under one rubric. The 2 cheers is this bringing in social preferences and bringing in context dependence. And my one qualm is this problem, I think, of a moving baseline. So in terms of social preferences, all this idea that, no man's, no woman's an island kind of business. Yeah, and I know that makes sense to me. If we're going to add in social isolation, what I do in Wyoming, out there in the middle of nowhere, is none of your business, right? What I do here, okay, maybe you're concerned. All right? Context dependence. This is my favorite. For a long time, we've dealt with state-dependent preferences. Ken Arrow came up and defined state-dependent preferences and complete contingent claims contracts as a way to make this stuff work. But context-dependent preferences gets a little trickier when the context is shifting, and it's not just whether it's raining or whether it's wet, some external force, but whether it's some internal context that you can't monitor. Now, the context of choice becomes way more funky to get a hold of, as we've seen. Context-dependent beliefs, why not? Context-dependent demand curves. Context-dependent cost-benefit analysis is the spooky part, because then you got context-dependent policy, and then the real question is, is it just policy like a pinwheel? And we built our models on context independence for a long time, and maybe we can adjust to this. I give it a cheer because it's worth thinking about. It sure is a big headache, though, in terms of demand analysis and in terms of some idea of what welfare theory is. Here's my qualm. Every good science needs an upper and a lower baseline. For a long time, our upper baseline is, as we've called it, Homo economicus. So I put the lower at Homo clueless, because we have to have a lower baseline. And I guess this reasonable baseline would be the Homo Simpson, or I called it the Homo contexto, because, it's the context that matters. And here's sort of why I get nervous about it. So for about 200-300 years, this is the only thing that economists were averse to, was risk. Or people in general, but economists especially, was risk aversion. And we can model this, we could handle it, we could build our models to handle it. Then Kahneman and Tversky and Thaler brought along loss aversion. Okay, all right, we treat losses differently than we treat gains. All right, maybe we can handle that. That's 2. And then I just was kind of cruising through EconLit to get an idea if, I'd kind of seen a few other aversions show up. Well, we are averse to a whole hell of a lot of stuff. Myopic loss aversion, ambiguity, inequality, lying, guilt, regret, disappointment, stress, extremeness, recession aversion. I saw one, inflation aversion. And so I started to think, well, what is the baseline anymore? What is my baseline? Because if we keep adding degrees of freedom, well, then your baseline is whatever it is. And it'd be easier to tell me what I'm not averse of than what I am averse of. So, wow, I'm already out of time. So if I wanted to think about it, Alan talked about essentially how do we value these efforts in the context of what we think of as behavioral economics. But for policy, it's really just a start. I mean, because I think of the market failure, and let's just call it behavioral failure or errors. I mean, if we correct a behavioral failure without correcting an externality, or vice versa, have we created a second best problem where welfare actually decreases if we don't think about structural market failure and behavioral failure at the same time? That's what interests me. And then what is at risk in terms of understanding risk assessment and analysis, and all the way down to the line, how do we value it and what it means here. And these next set of questions I'm going to go through quickly because I'm almost out of time, but these are questions that I've asked my graduate students at least for 17 years now, every year. Some of my students have run with it. Some of them have come back and said, what? And so I'm going to give them to you guys too, but I'll go through them a little slower. Number one, what exactly are the axioms of hypothetical behavior? I think that's a lot of what David was talking about between reported and what you're thinking about and what you actually do. That's always been something that's bothered me. We have an axiom of real behavior, but we don't really have axioms of hypothetical behavior that somebody has fundamentally defined. And these are going to sort of increase in terms of importance. What's the association between hypothetical and actual, or perhaps normative and revealed? You could say it that way as well. We've done a lot of work on trying to manipulate the gap between what we say and what we do, both ex ante and ex post, trying to understand that. How do we close it? What are we doing? I don't have time to go through it all, but there's a whole lot of work trying to understand that. What's the relationship between market experience and hypothetical and actual behavior in terms of people's preferences being fixed or fungible is the easiest way to think about it. And what I've spent a lot of time doing is think about number 4, how do we use market experience to remove this anomalous behavior and preference elicitation? What we actually did was take laptops to Yellowstone, and people would come into Yellowstone, and we'd say, come on and do the survey. We'd get them on there, and we'd run them through lotteries, and we'd turn them into a money pump. So they would value a low probability, high severity outcome a lot more than the other one, but they preferred the safe bet. It's classic preference reversal. Run them through the money pump, take money away from them, give them no lottery, and then ask them to answer some hypothetical wildlife questions about protection in Yellowstone. And man, they were rational. It was pretty neat. We actually created the people we assumed we had. So if you want to think about an economist trying to make the world more like the model, we did it. We did it. We also ran it off through the New York Times, and it worked there as well. So this idea of a rationality spillover, I guess in psychologists call it transfer or generality. I might be mixing up the terms. How does preference elicitation fit into coordination games? Well, this is a big question. And at number 6 is sort of where I'll stop. At what point do we stop monetizing these preferences? And we looked at those virtual reality valuation experiments where people are flying through the landscape. I got to see one last week where they showed us flying through wildfires, say in Montana. And I'm thinking about that seriously, going, you know what? I'm not willing to pay to reduce wildfires. I'm willing to pay to fly in that virtual reality game again because that was fun. And, you know, I mean, I was like a bird in Montana. Wow, an eagle. And then I talked to my son. I said, why don't you go out and play soccer? He goes, no, I'm playing soccer. Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not sure what virtual reality is going to get us, to tell you the truth. The other thing is something like this. $3.54 per trout fishing trip in the year 2050, which was an actual number. You know, it's a beautiful study, but it finally got my goat. Because, you know, in 2050, my opportunity set for trout fishing is going to be way different. I mean, I'm going to be 92. I am going to be in a holodeck, and I'm going to be catching the biggest dang fish you ever saw in 50 years if this virtual reality stuff works out. So, you know, at what point can we say anything about values that far out, about opportunity sets we don't understand? And, you know, with those 6 questions, you know, that's a lot to think about. And I keep asking them year after year after year, not because I ever expect an answer, but what I expect is to get my students to think down these frames about how can we, you know, help you guys by not overshooting what we can deliver, but at the same time understanding the guardrails about what we can. So this is sort of trying to be more constructive. I mean, all these biases and all the past survey designs we've seen in evaluation work, the present questions about framing and institutional issues, and now future work is we're focusing on just letting people state an interval of values, not forcing them into a point, but just letting them give a range and trying to understand why that range exists. And the last one is an oath, where we make people actually solemnly swear to tell the truth before answering a valuation experiment. Let me just give you just one picture. There is the real, actual behavior. There's the line below, and hypothetical is above. And when we made them swear to the oath, we got the high-end people who were violating their budget constraint to come down. We got the low-end people who were otherwise violating their participation constraint to come up. Now, am I saying the oath is the silver bullet? No, but we've had them for like thousands of years. Let's try them. And maybe it's one way to apply psychology and behavioral economics to improve things. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the final speaker in the session is David Scotty from University of California, San Diego. David?
I would just like to go on record as objecting to following Jason, which seems inherently unfair. So actually, a couple of the things I'm going to talk about have been at least briefly touched on by some of the other speakers. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit is there's been a lot of discussion about measuring preferences and what things influence preferences. And I would like to talk a little bit more on a theoretical basis, but also with some data about which preferences we should be measuring. Okay, so I think many of the things that have been said all apply, but to various parts of the puzzle. And so just to make things a little simpler in terms of terminology, I'd like to not use the word preference, which has a fairly specific technical meaning, particularly in economics, but in lots of other disciplines as well. And let's just talk about how we evaluate the outcomes that we're going to use in risk analysis or decision analysis or cost-benefit analysis. And the two topics I want to talk about today is the idea that outcomes may be evaluated from different temporal perspectives, before, during, and after, and that participants and observers may have different perspectives on the same outcomes. These are very practical questions in policy analysis, and I'll give you a number of examples of how those might meaningfully differ. So first of all, we all have a multiple personality problem when it comes to preferences, and that is that in the traditional analysis, we use preferences, which are inherently an ex ante construct. You make the decisions based on your preferences before you know what it's actually going to be like to have the choice that you receive. Now, of course, there have been some mention of experience, and that can certainly help, and I'll show you some examples of that. So one type of perspective is what we think will make us happy or unhappy or satisfied, etc. And so the ex ante self, which we call the wanting self, we have choice, forecasting, anticipation. It is the temporal time frame before the event, experience, product, etc., is obtained. Then we have the experiencing self, which is the real-time self that was mentioned earlier, I think by Alan, where the governing things are sensation, emotion, and reaction. This is the Bentham idea of how are we doing right now. Think of a thermometer that measures the current temperature. Edgeworth called it a hedonometer, how are you doing right now? So it's a running utility measure, almost like on the consumer products and political shows where you see how people are reacting to a speech up and down, that type of idea. And then there's after. There's the remembering self. When we look back on an experience or a product or an event, we rarely have the same view of it as we did while we were in the middle of it or as we did before. Okay? No, so how these things are similar or different is what I'd like to expand on next. So the problem is that the outcome evaluations that we obtain for inputs into our analysis models may differ from these three perspectives. So why should we choose those? Let's start with a problem that we're all familiar with. The wanting self. Would you be happier if you were richer? The answer is yes. Not complicated, right? Okay, well, it turns out that some of us have actually studied this question. Nice topic, right? And so one of the things that we were able to do, in this particular sample, we had over 1,000 people, I think it was, jury-eligible adults. And here we have people who either had a household income of under $20,000 or a household income of over $100,000. And the percentage of the day they were in a bad mood, so more is worse here, was about a third for people under $20,000 household income. That includes a mild bad mood, not just a terrible mood. And about 20% for people over $100,000. So there is about a 50% difference in the percentage of time in a bad mood, or an actual real difference. You are happier if you're richer. Okay? And so the question is, do we know that? And how would we weight that if we use a traditional choice survey or revealed preference in the form of choice to measure that? Well, it turns out if you ask people how much percentage of the time would someone be in a bad mood if they had a household income of less than $27,000, they say 57% of the time instead of 32%. And you ask people how often would someone be in a bad mood with a $100,000 income, 25% of the time. And so the actual difference is about 12.2% between the two for people who actually are in that situation, who are experiencing that event, versus 32% for people who are imagining that event, that difference. So people are exaggerating this difference, and it works for all kinds of other things. We've got dozens of these different kinds of comparisons. People tend to exaggerate. And just to show you that the finality here, that nothing you can say, Adam Smith didn't say 250 years ago, there it is. Okay? It's really almost the exact thing that we've been imagining right there. So it's this idea that ex ante, we tend to give a different weight to the features of a particular object or event than we might when we actually have the object or event. So here's the famous Easterlin graph, which shows that the percentage of people in the United States who are describe themselves as very happy has been flat to declining over the last 50-plus years, even though real income has more than tripled. And just in case you think that's an anomaly from the U.S., in China they do everything faster nowadays. And so in only the last 10 years, they've had a 250% jump in real income with the opening of the economy and no increase in people saying how happy they are. All right, so clearly there's something interesting about the experience of having more income and how much we think we might feel as we have more income. So what's one of the problems we have here that relates to this temporal perspective? Things don't last forever. So, for example, here's the marriage graph from a massive study in Germany. And so basically, people, this is 4 years before you get married. Year 0 is the year you get married, 5 years after marriage. So, things are going along okay. You're a little bit above average. Then you meet the one. Okay, and things get really great. Then you get married, and then it's all downhill after that. And I think the divorce happens right there. And so things, getting married, which is a socially valued status, does in fact have a positive effect, but it doesn't last forever. Similarly, the unhappy event of losing your partner or spouse also has a similar type of problem. That person often is getting sicker and then eventually departs, and then you do rebound, although not all the way back to where you were before. So this is a positive event and a negative event that have the same quality that is called adaptation in this literature. And so the idea is that changes in your states of your life have their largest effect near the time they occur. So when you just buy that car or when you just move into the new house, that's when it has the maximum effect. But after a while, you get used to it, and it doesn't have quite the same effect on your happiness as before. So we like to distinguish between changes and states. So becoming a paraplegic versus being a paraplegic. Getting married versus being married. That's a classic. Buying a new car versus owning the new car and taking it to the repair shop, etc. Okay? So do people believe that this will happen? And this gets back to the question of, do we use the ex ante, the before preferences, as measured? Because are we trying to measure how happy people actually will be if we institute this policy, or are we trying to maximize how happy people think they will be if we institute the policy? Okay? And if we think that the matter is what actually happens, then we have to think about this question of whether people are actually accurately predicting this empirical phenomenon of adaptation that we observe. So the short answer is there's a lot of evidence now that's growing over the last 10 to 15 years that people underpredict adaptation. Okay, so the experiencing self, a little more depth on this to get an idea of why it might be different. So why aren't people who are richer, the 100,000 plus income, happier? Well, these are different activities in which you can spend your time. Work and commute. So you spend more time working because you don't suddenly become rich and everything is the same in your life. You get a job that pays more, which has more responsibility, maybe more hours, no more, going home and having a six-pack. You have to actually work after you get home and so on. Okay, you do more compulsory activities that typically involves things around the house. Eating slightly more, so you go out to eat a little bit more. That's good. Active leisure is better. That's good. And passive leisure, principally watching TV, goes down. So it's a mixed bag. The thing is, work and commute are negative activities. Active leisure is better than passive leisure, and eating is good too. So you have kind of a mixed bag in the change of how you use your time. And on average, it kind of averages out to a slight improvement, but not nearly the improvement that we imagine. Remember, in our science paper, it was 2.5 times the impact that people predicted compared to what they experienced. Okay, with marriage, you have a similar type of thing, and I'll just say very quickly so I can get to the rest of my things, that you spend less time alone, which is good, more time with your nuclear family, that's you and your spouse and your children if you had them before, but less time with your friends, you have less discretionary time, and you do more stuff around the house. Okay, so it's a balance, and so that's the difference between measuring experience utility and predicted utility. Does experience matter? This was mentioned by some of the earlier presenters. And so in another study, we showed these are different bad things or good things that can happen, becoming a paraplegic, being blinded, or winning the lottery. And so after 1 month, the question is, how happy is this person after 1 month? And from both people who know no one with the condition, so this is the naive other party, this is someone who's experienced. I believe that was mentioned earlier. There's no difference. People with and without experience predict in both cases how good or bad the event is. But 1 year later, when you ask them to predict how happy will this person be a year later, the people with experience realize that adaptation is going to occur. The people with no experience predict the same thing as if they had been just 1 month away. So this really gets to this point. Someone was talking about getting experienced. And I don't want to go as far as Jason and create Frankenstein, Franco-economicus or whatever it is. But at the same time, this idea that experience affects how people perceive the utility, even in experience, is really important. So the bottom line here is that people often fail to predict adaptation because they accurately predict the utility of the change, but do not anticipate that the state will be different than the change over time. Some healthcare applications. For time's sake, let me go to the best one. So here's caregivers versus patients. This is a fascinating and terrible study. If you ask people, would you take a grueling course of chemotherapy in return for 3 extra months of life? Okay. If you ask radiotherapists, 0% say yes. Oncologists, 6%. Healthy individuals who are not have cancer, 10%. Cancer patients, 42%. Experts versus patients. Whose preferences are the right ones there? Well, it's a very powerful example of how the question of being in that situation in the experience is very different than anticipating it ahead of time. This is a wonderful study by Peter Ubel and colleagues about kidney transplant patients. And what he shows is that before the transplant, the experience well-being, this is on a 0 to 100 quality of life scale, was 64, and after the transplant, it was 76, so a difference of 12.6. So it was an improvement. And in fact, kidney transplants are a great example of a good public policy because they pay for themselves in terms of Medicare. But he also asked people before the fact, how happy will you be after the transplant? And they said 91. And then he asked people after the transplant, how happy do you remember being before the transplant? 47. They tremendously exaggerated, both before and after, what the effect of the change would be. Okay? And so if we use their utilities, we would want to pay even more for kidney transplants than we would otherwise. Okay? So this is why this exaggeration really matters. So last but not least, I can't do this talk without the colonoscopy study, which most of you have seen by now probably. But the idea is how do people remember an experience? Do they remember it the same way as they experienced it? And so colonoscopies, for those of you who haven't had this pleasure, are extended experiences that have different sensations. So these are diagrams that show graphs of the momentary experience. That's the hedonometer, okay, for patients having colonoscopies. This is a patient who had a shorter colonoscopy and a patient who had a longer one. And so you look at those two, and this is pain. So the vertical axis is pain. So more is worse here. So more area under the curve is more pain. All right, that's really the idea, time times amount of pain. So which patient has the better experience? Most people say this one. Less total pain, right? Less total time. But then you ask the people who had the colonoscopies to go back and look at their own pain profiles and think about, no, they don't look at the profiles. They try and remember what their experience was. Which one do they prefer? They prefer this one. Because they remember most the peak and the end. And that's the parts of the experience that are easiest to remember, and not the duration. And so because of that, if you want people to come back for a repeat colonoscopy, you should add a period of diminishing pain at the end because it improves the memory of the experience. I've talked with various dentists about this as well, and they have the same kind of thing about doing particularly unpleasant dental procedures, that they try and ease people out at the end and not have the worst possible thing be right at the end of the episode, because it says then they're afraid when they come back. So you can actually use a lot of kind of ideas like this depending on which policy objective that you're after. It may or may not be the case that the ex-ante preference is the proper method to use. Okay, so quick summary. The same thing feels and looks different before, during, and after in terms of evaluation of the outcomes. The same thing looks and feels different to those who do and don't have the experience. Many things matter in the short run, but eventually they lose their power. Different perspectives for different applications. If what you want to do is get people to come back, you think about the memory. If you're looking about voting, that's ex ante, and so ex ante is the right thing. If you're trying to figure out whether people are going to buy more products when they're there at Disneyland and things like that, then you're really looking at experience. There's a real question of whether these things are important, particularly for, let's say, disabled or disadvantaged groups in society, and there's very much this idea that you should focus at least partially on the experience. And, of course, Adam Smith said it all 200 years ago.
Okay, so people will queue up at the microphone. We'll move up to the main side. See if you can sit where you need.
Good to meet you.
Ready?
Yeah, I love that.
Ready?
Okay. Matt.
Matt Adler, UPenn Law School. This is particularly for David Laibson, but also, I guess, for the whole panel. David, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the view that someone's behavior or her revealed preferences are not the same necessarily as her normative preferences, right? So Lisa's behavior, for example, doesn't necessarily reveal her normative preferences. The question which I struggle with, and I'd like to see what you might say something about, is how exactly do we define Lisa's normative preferences? I mean, a lot of your examples have to do with mistake or lack of information. So, first cut is to say, Lisa's normative preferences are what Lisa prefers with full information. But the problem is Lisa might be perfectly normatively rational, acting with less than full information. Information might be costly and so forth, right? So a second cut is to say, well, no, we want to take account of that. So Lisa's normative preferences have to do with her preferences, when she complies with, say, expected utility theory. But then the question is, well, what makes expected utility theory normative for Lisa? Another thrust of your talk was something like, well, what people endorsed, right? The conditions that people endorse for themselves are normatives. So what is it? So we go and sort of ask Lisa, do you like expected utility theory? What if Lisa hadn't really thought about it? And she says, no, I agree with LA that expected utility theory actually is not normative. So then we have to say what's normative for Lisa are, decisional preferences or preference conditions that she endorses under good conditions or something like that. But then how do we define those good conditions? We're back in a circle. Another issue is emotions, right? I mean, are normative preferences of someone in a calm state or an emotional state? What if Lisa in a calm state says, oh, I like preferences in a calm state, but Lisa in an emotional state, no, it's my emotional preferences that are normative. I mean, I very much agree with the thrust of your comments, but it seems to me we have to have a discussion about how we then define someone's normative preferences.
Do we respond? Yeah, go ahead. So I love that question. You've basically said, yes, the standard economic approach, which ignores all the issues you just touched on, we need to put aside, and we need to build a new framework, and I would say frameworks, to begin to get closer to a consensus view on how we should measure this thing. And all the issues that you raised need to be in the conversation, and that's why when I ended up describing what I consider to be useful guides to normative preferences, I didn't have a single criterion. I had 6 different ways of thinking about the problem. And when I try to infer normative preferences, I want most, if not all, of those criteria to point in the same direction. So I think we need to have multiple filters, and only when a normative preference passes nearly all of them do we then conclude, okay, now we think we actually have something that is sensible and reliable and something we can build policy onto. But if it only passes a few of them, if Lisa's informed, but she still does things that the experts say are nonsensical, and she still has behavior that's constantly fluctuating around, information may not be enough, as you suggested. So we need all of those hurdles, or most of those hurdles, to get crossed before we want to get comfortable engaging in policies that might be paternalistic as we nudge people towards better choices.
Just very quickly, one example is safe sex that George Lowenstein's done a lot of work on with teenagers in particular. And there you have what he calls the empathy gap. And the empathy gap is between the person ex ante before they get into the situation where she looks you into the eye and she wants you, and versus the decision to in that moment in the heat of passion, literally of what are your preferences then. And what happens is people don't comply in that situation. And so the cold state ex ante doesn't represent at all the type of decision-making process the person's actually going to have to experience at the time they have to do the thing that's really important. So I think that's a kind of a situation where it might work a lot to look at experience utility. But in a well-functioning market with competition and consumer protection, what's wrong with the ex-ante version? It works just fine. So I think it's situation-dependent to me.
Jonathan Weiner from Duke University. This is a question potentially for the whole panel, but in all of these studies of learning over time or adaptive preferences over time or the findings of apparently overstated effects between the wanting, experiencing, and remembering self, to what extent are those errors in predicting or recasting preferences, or to what extent is the self changing so that it's actually a different person or a different conception of self that's answering the question at different points in life or as a result of different experiences? And I think Derek Parfit writes about this some, or there's the conventional experience of remembering a choice that one made earlier in life and thinking, that just wasn't me. That wasn't. I can't imagine that I'm the same person who made that blunder or chose that path. So, to what extent is actually the self evolving?
You're the normative guy. You should go first.
I think that the multiple self perspective is very plausible. It is one of the hardest perspectives to adopt because then the normative question is radically complexified. Now we no longer have a single agent who we are trying to help or optimize for, but now we have a collection of agents. So a lot of the intertemporal choice literature has been embedded in that multiple self framework, and the criteria that are then applied range from adopt the perspective of the original self zero, to adopt a Pareto criterion that looks for a frontier for all the selves to adopt some other weighting function that is a particular point on the Pareto frontier. But certainly, everyone in that literature agrees that there are lots of points that are Pareto dominated for the collection of selves, and we can at least agree to be out of that interior space. So I'm sympathetic with the way you framed it. Unfortunately, that makes our lives harder, but if that's reality, so be it.
I want to. All these multiple selves gives me a case of schizophrenia, so I don't want to. I want to think about it. Think about a slightly different question, which I think is much more within our grasp to discuss and bound, which is how different people fall into different groups. So, some of these people in David's experiment must have been, quite homo economicus. They were rational. I was waiting to see some statistics on that, and maybe you have them. And I find in our focus group work, in particular, where you can test these kind of things with small groups, we find groups that are people who are rational. They're really weighing all the choices. They're thinking the way economists would think about an issue in cost-benefit analysis, for instance. There are other people who are really literal. They're just kind of taking the words the way they are in the answer. And then there's people who are skeptical of everything. And they're going to be the ones who are rejecting the game you're trying to play and so on. And I'd like to get a better handle, and I think from our group, if I had to loosely say it, it's about a third. But I'd like to get a sense from the experiments that you guys are doing about that. How many people are rational, how many are those are not rational, what O'Reilly calls naives, and those who know they're irrational and then adopt approaches to make them rational, what he calls the sophisticates.
Well, I'm going to retreat back to my institutional world, which is if we think markets really do sort of act as a catalyst for more rational behavior, then to me it would say you're really worried about this behavioral second best, about multiple selves and all this business, then you should be using cap and trade for all your problems, because it is the one thing of exchange that is going to sort of drive people down this path like the people we assume are operating, as opposed to other types of market-based incentives. Maybe the price isn't enough to do it. It is the process of exchange, which, but I just want to put a plug in for my new book now, based on David. Frankonomics-stein. I think it could sell.
Thanks. I'll expect my payment later. I would just like to agree with what the greater David, I guess I'm the lesser David over here since I came second, said that we don't want to overdraw the before, during, and after, or the self-other distinctions, participant or observer distinctions. People are not crazy. They know that a root canal is bad, and a date with your beloved is good, and all of the selves know that, and so they're highly correlated. Now, how highly is really the problem, isn't it? And is the error systematic between those different perspectives, or is it random? And so I think what we have seen in the research is that there's a lot of systematic variation in the differences between these, and that's what gives you pause more so than that there are any errors at all, differences at all. And so that's why I think that we don't want to either say you get a personality transplant before, during, and after. This is not true. Okay, there's a lot of stability between those, but there's enough difference, and it's enough measurable, manipulable difference in terms of the design of the context and so on, that I think we have to be very wary of trusting that what happens at one time automatically tells us exactly and proportionally what will happen at another time.
To come back to answer your question in a sentence, it's just a life cycle effect. You begin as a novice agent with a naive perspective on not only the environment that you're in, but on your ability to engage in self-regulation. And you emerge after multiple experiences in that environment with much greater sophistication. So it's environmentally and experientially dependent.
Kerry Smith, I have a question and a comment. Most of the behavioral economic work that's done and the examples that are offered to nudge consumers in one direction or another are often about private choices that they make that have largely private consequences. That is, sometimes there's less savings than we'd like at a national level or something else. But the dominant component of the consequences fall to the individual, and we're concerned because the individual is, from the expert's perspective, making a choice that we think is not as good as they could have made. The vast majority of the benefit cost analysis that's undertaken is undertaken precisely because choices can't be made by private individuals, that there is some element of non-rivalry or non-exclusivity or some mechanism in the way in which the good or service is delivered that requires that it be done as a collective. And the question then becomes, if we are not sure about the way of translating, and I'll repeat, the only thing that we know are choices. Economists construct the preference functions, people don't have them, or psychologists construct the preference functions to try to use those choices. How do we then, if everybody has a diversity of those functions, how do we then organize the set of choices for collective decisions? That's the question. The comment. If we were to use questions such as those that are used for happiness surveys or life satisfaction surveys in contingent valuation or in choice experiments, we would be drummed out of the survey business because there is no baseline reported. It's these days. How are you feeling these days? Are you very happy, pretty happy, or not at all happy? And so I think that we need to improve the margin of those before we start to take those results seriously. Thank you.
So there were two questions there. I'll just answer the one about collective action. I'll let you answer the one about happiness. So my proposal is that we do what we have always done. Write down a social objective function and optimize policy so that, subject to resource constraints, we maximize social welfare. But the only way that I deviate from the traditional approach is that when we write down that social welfare function, we don't use revealed preferences to impute the discount rate. We don't use revealed preferences to impute risk aversion. We instead recognize that revealed preferences need to be taken with a grain of salt so that when we end up with, at the end of this exercise, a social welfare function, it acknowledges that some of the behavior that we observe is jointly determined by true normative preferences and by decision-making errors. So it's only a tweak to the standard cost-benefit program for collective action.
We're working on it, Kerry, honestly. I agree with you that there are some limitations to the measures, but I think if you believe people can state a willingness to pay, I don't understand why that is somehow different than stating how they feel at a particular time. Why can we believe the one and not the other? Well, but it's a well-defined choice to say on an intensity scale, how intense is a particular pain at this time? You know, and doctors take that seriously all the time. And the world functions, and decisions are made, and people get healed. So I think it's overstating to say that people are not able to access that private state that we cannot externally observe at all in responding. I think there's enough systematic variance there. Whether it's enough for a particular purpose, that's a legitimate question.
Just quickly, to reiterate David's point to my right, is the James Buchanan's book, Cost and Choice, written back in 1969, where essentially makes the argument that it's the ex-ante perspective that defines choice. It's like thinking about a house burning down as opposed to going through the ashes trying to figure out why it burned down. And he lays out sort of the welfare implications of that. And it was a big motivation for using stated preference methods way back in the early days of contingent valuation. So, again, I think there's a lot of overlap here in what we're doing and places we are coming to from different angles. So it's worth looking at.
Ted Miller. I have a comment and a question. I'll be brief. In the context of happiness, there's a lot of literature that says that people, for example, who are injured when asked about their happiness tend to adjust their rating because their expectations have changed. They may be very happy, but if you'd asked them 6 months before their injury whether that state that they're in now they'd be happy in, they would have said no, but now they say, God, that I can be this good is great. They can also be very happy because their kid told them yesterday that they're getting married, or miserable because their wife told them yesterday that she's leaving them. So it's a dangerous measure at the actual level, I think. I think that probably the remembered is more likely to be accurate. Having said that, my question, which I'm going to phrase in the context of the wanting and remembering self, but it may be that it could be phrased in other ways as well, is a two-part question. If I'm in the courtroom and I need to compensate somebody by, quote, trying to provide financial compensation that will return them to their prior state, which self-valuation do I want to use? And then framed in that context, as a regulatory analyst, which self-valuation do I want to use?
Very good. Let me take the second one first. Remember, willingness to pay and willingness to accept. Why don't we use willingness to accept, which is the normatively correct measure? Well, it's because we get numbers we can't use. Okay? And I think the same thing is true in your case here when you say, if we look at the remembered utility, as we saw in that example of the kidney transplant patients, they thought they were a lot more miserable before than they actually were, at least in terms of their self-reports. So I think there's an interesting question there, practical question, of whether, since we don't know for sure what the right thing is, I think there's a practical question of what's a workable solution for that. I think the other question about the variability of day-to-day feeling or moment-to-moment feeling is, of course, again, a good question, but that's a sampling problem that can be solved with large samples as well. So I think that's one way to deal with the problem of the variability.
I want to address this to the young David. I was I didn't say the good-looking David. I said the young David. I was very confused by your glib answer going to Pareto optimality for the two or multiple selves. I think that's what I would call the three faces of Eve, or the werewolf approach to the multiple selves. Three Phases of Eve you probably don't remember, but the older David does, it was a famous book about a woman with multiple personalities, and they came out at various times, and she couldn't control them. And the same thing as the werewolf who comes out on the night of the full moon. And I used to learn from you about self-control. And one of the elements of self-control is you can change the percentage of time that the different Richards come into play. And the way you do that is by making Richard B less well off, without in any way changing Richard A. And I think, therefore, the saying that we should look for Pareto optimality is not the right thing to do. Indeed, the prime lesson of self-control is to make certain states less valuable, since it's very hard to make other states more valuable. So was I right listening to David 4 years ago or David today?
That's a great point. I was thinking about a different case where there's the David on Tuesday, David on Wednesday, David on Thursday case, and there is no endogeneity of their arrival since it's tied to the calendar. But I love your point that to the extent that it's David cued by a giant bowl of potato chips versus David cued by a giant bowl of peaches, and I have control earlier in the day whether I put out bowls of potato chips or peaches, absolutely, let's put out bowls of peaches and let's manipulate our tendency to emerge with perhaps self-defeating preferences during certain cue-based moments. And the sex example that was coming up earlier is a great one. If someone knows that when they are in an environment where they're about to have unprotected sex, sensibleness goes out the window, well, avoid such environments. And then we end up, I think, with a much more reasonable long-run outcome. So absolutely, I embrace your let's keep the werewolves in the closet proposal.
But in defense of the Pareto solution that the other David mentioned, I think, just suppose for a second that there's just two selves to make things simple, and that the overlap between the two is 80% of the variance. Okay? And so that 80% of what a person, David on Tuesday and David on Wednesday, would do are the same. Well, I think there is a logic to say that you can design a policy that accommodates that 80%, the inertial part. And to the extent we can identify that, at least provides a baseline. Jason wants a baseline for what you can work with, and at least you know you're going to get that. And then if you're able to do some other things, and I think it's kind of like satisfying all of Savage's axioms. If you can get 5 out of 6, it's a pretty good day, on a stated preference survey, at least in my experience. And that's kind of what Alan was saying earlier about the responses to people. And so I think to that extent, I'm a little more hopeful about being able to find a core that stands still across these different things that can at least help us to keep from being total anarchy.
I'd like to reiterate that I do want a baseline, because
I like that the word anarchy was the last word almost of this group.
All right. Well, let's thank the panel and thank everybody for their questions.